So in today's web dev tip, we're going to add a bit of JavaScript or TypeScript to our View Stats button so that when the user clicks it, we take the value from the input box that they've provided to us, and then we redirect them to the stats application with that URL. So a couple of things here. We want to make sure that we're targeting the elements correctly and getting their values out, and then we just need to do a redirect in the browser to redirect the user to the right URL. So let's get cracking with that. If we go over to our markup and just make sure that we've got some IDs for the inputs and the buttons. So I think yesterday we added an ID for the short URL, but didn't actually add an ID for the button either. So let's just add that in now. So short URL, just call it short URL button so that it matches the ID for the input. And then we can use those in our TypeScript code to target those elements and then do the redirect process when the user clicks the button. So let me just close up some of our existing functions here where we're actually doing the loading of the actual data. Probably should break this out into a separate function and move it out, but for the moment let's just crack on with what we need to do to get this redirect working. So we've got the short URL button, which is document get element by ID, and that is the ID of that particular element. And let's copy that again, and it is for the ID. So this is the actual form input, the actual where we can get the value of the short URL ID. And then we're just going to set an event listener up on the button. So let's grab that, add event listener, and it's a click event. We're not too interested in the event object again in this instance. We just want to actually trigger our own code. So what we're going to do, first of all, we get the value that the user's typed in. So let's get the short URL value. So it's from the short URL ID from this element that we've previously selected. Let's get the value. Oh, and we're actually getting a bit of a TypeScript error there. It's probably going to complain and saying that, So generically, the get element by ID just returns a HTML element type, which may or may not have a value. But we can fix that by just saying it's a HTML input element, which will have the value property, and then that TypeScript error goes away. So we've got the value. What do we do now? Well, all we need to do really is say on the window object, we can access the location property or the location object, and then there's a few different things that we can do here. We can either call a method such as replace, or we can actually modify one of the properties like href, and that will just redirect the user to this particular location. Okay, so where are we going to redirect the user to? Well, we're just going to redirect them to /stats and then / the short URL value that we've just extracted from the input box a moment ago. And that should be enough. It'll handle both the production and the local host environment. So if we just go and reload the app, let's just try it out with a random short URL. You can see now it's redirecting us to stats and then / whatever we've typed in. So if we get a genuine one here from localhost, so we'll grab that and pop that in there and view stats, and now you can see it's taken us to the actual stats application and showing us the stats, although there aren't any for this particular URL, and then we've got the option to add another one as well. So one thing we just need to be careful with user input is we might have some spaces in there. So for example, when we actually get that short URL, and if we put some spaces on the end, the users put a space. I'll make sure I haven't put any extra characters in. You can see that we get a problem saying that there's no short URL with that particular ID. And that is because that space is being passed to the database, and we're just trying to find an ID of an item in the database that has all the spaces on as well. So that's pretty simple to fix. We just call the trim function on the string, the value that's returned from the input box. And hopefully now if we do something like that, where we paste in the short URL and put some spaces in, you can see it still finds that particular ID in the database because it's removed any white space on either side of the string that the user's put in. So there you go, that finishes off the home page, if you will, for the stats application. So we're just giving the user some options of how they can actually find stats on the short URL ID. In the next tutorial, we're just going to start finishing up the app and look at some of the last user stories for adding some instructions and some navigation onto the apps as well. But that's it for this tutorial. Make sure you stay tuned for more web dev tips.